We could not reach him Monday, but in lieu of Kevin, we did have a great chat with Annette Meeks, who's quoted extensively in the piece. In the gist of the piece is that Minneapolis is in great trouble for all of the reasons we've been discussing. But Kevin might have angles on this that are going to be terribly informative to us. So you just tell me when Kevin's ready.
Kevin's on the line.
Hi, Kevin.
Hey, what's up?
Where am I reaching you?
Dallas.
Okay. You got heat again, I hope?
Yeah, we were lucky in my neighborhood. Our electricity stayed on and all that stuff. So other than one frozen water pipe that we were able to fix with a hairdryer, we were in good shape.
Kevin, what compelled you to write this piece for National Review?
Well, I've been writing a lot of pieces about American cities over the years, all the bankrupt cities in California. I did a big one on Portland. I did one on Philadelphia and its crime problems. And Minneapolis has been on my list for a while because it's a place that used to be a highly functional city in many ways and no longer is. And I think that Minneapolis, like Portland, is it's in the future for the rest of the country. You know, it represents, it's ahead of the curve of where the rest of the country is. The problems it has are problems that are typical of most big American cities, including Dallas, where I live. But they are more advanced there, and the problems have grown substantially worse there than they have in a lot of comparable cities.
The phrase we've used for years on the show is the closer you get to the country's tallest buildings, the more likely you are to find incompetence in the political leadership.
I don't know that that's true.
Good.
You know, they don't have a lot of real tall buildings in, parts of Southern California that aren't Los Angeles, but they got some really, really bad government out there.
Right.
They don't have a lot of really, really tall buildings in a lot of the prairie states, but they've got some pretty bad government in those. I don't think there are any tall buildings in Ohio at all, are there? It's a badly governed place.
Well, Cleveland and Columbus have tall buildings.
Yeah, they've got a couple of tall buildings, but you know what I'm talking about.
I do.
Dallas
Yeah,
is not a super impressive skyline with that government here. So I get that, conservatives have a certain skepticism towards cities and urban life. I think that's a real problem for conservatives moving forward because if we can't speak to people who live in the cities, we aren't going to have much of a political future because that's where Americans live. But we have to look at things from an institutional point of view. We have to look at things from a services point of view. We have to ask ourselves why it is that people who live in big cities tend to not share our politics and our assumptions and see what we can do to speak to that. But what's really criminal malpractice on the part of Republicans, I think, is not just simply pointing to this stuff. You know, if it hadn't been for the plague this year and the Democrats were planning to have their convention in Milwaukee,
Mm-hmm.
What is the best thing ever to happen to Republicans? Just send a guy to Milwaukee and walk around and say, here's Democratic government work, here's Democratic government work, here's Democratic government work. The place is a mess. But you could do that in any big American city. And one of the problems with big American cities is that they're full of Americans. Mm-hmm. And Americans have really abandoned, in many ways, the sense of civic-mindedness and responsibility and moral seriousness that are necessary for self-government. I'll tell you, if you take two examples, New York City and Dallas, where I live, both had mayors who were business guys. Bloomberg in New York, who, in spite of all of his personal oddness, was basically a guy who was running an administration that was oriented toward competence, good performance, non-ideological. We had the same thing in Dallas with a guy named Mike Rollins, who had been the CEO of Pizza Hut. And neither city appreciated that. And both of those guys were replaced by people who were cranks, who were incompetent, left-wing maniacs. And we've seen similar things happening in Minneapolis, of course, where it's always been a center-left city. I mean, at least since, the 1930s or whatever.
Right.
But where traditional kind of, normal, within the realm of normal liberal Democrats are no longer crazy enough for Minneapolis. And the DFL is no longer crazy enough for Minneapolis. And so you get these, more extreme figures. And you also get people who are more plugged into the politics of symbolism and social justice and all that, who tend to be less competent as administrators, which you really notice in a city. You can be in the Senate and just give speeches for 30 years and it doesn't make any difference. But if you're a mayor or a governor and you can't do your job, and we're certainly seeing that in a lot of big American cities, mayors who can't do their job, then you've got a real pressing problem. And it doesn't take 20 years for people to figure it out. It takes, a couple of months. After Bloomberg left office, the troubles in New York got much, much worse very, very quickly. I was there for it. I was still living in New York at that time, and you could see it everywhere from the sidewalks to the subways, every place else in the city. You see it in Texas with the homelessness encampments here in Dallas, Austin, Houston, places like that. And, of course, you see it in Minneapolis, which has a particular kind of obnoxious NPR preening liberal culture, but one that was always sort of married to more or less responsible prairie type government. They were they might have been crazy left wingers, but they were crazy left wingers whose grandparents were sensible Lutheran farmers, and some of that stuck with them over the years, and that really informed the sense of kind of responsibility and cooperativeness. Politeness, which was a big thing, and people, don't understand the practical role of courtesy in government and the practical role of not treating everyone as a personal enemy who has different political views from yours. And that is something that's really, people in Minneapolis talked about a lot when I was interviewing people up there, that the formerly kind of tolerant and collegial atmosphere of Minneapolis politics has really been replaced by this very aggressive, very angry, very shrill, kind of social justice politics.
Why do you think that happened?
It's boredom, I think. I think that Minneapolis, like a lot of places, is a victim of its own success. Even the U.S. cities that are having a lot of trouble right now still aren't where New York was in the 1970s or where Detroit was in the 1980s. Mm-hmm. Minneapolis had it pretty good. You had a pretty thriving downtown. Tax revenues looked good. People were moving in. Real estate values were up. Tax revenues were strong. When people get comfortable, they start to indulge their interests in their worst excesses because we respond to prosperity and stability and good government with boredom. Now, you look at a guy like you look at the Eisenhower administration. Probably the textbook case of good government in Washington, of people who were just committed to trying to do things effectively. The American people were terribly bored of it and ran in the opposite direction as fast as they could when he left office.
Mm-hmm. Kevin, as recently, guys, help me here. As recently as, is it 3 years ago now, there was a Super Bowl here and a Final Four, and the European-like cafe society was flourishing, and public transportation was in vogue, and the city could not have been more alive. The decline has to be in part attributed to the COVID and also the George Floyd situation.
Sure.
Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I think that those were traumatizing events that exacerbated and laid bare underlying problems. So I think that a lot of cities, if they'd gone through something like the George Floyd episode, would have had outcomes a lot like that in Minneapolis, because other cities have the same kinds of underlying problems. You could easily imagine this happening in Philadelphia. You could easily imagine it happening in Cincinnati. You could easily imagine it happening in Oakland. All sorts of places that could have similar kinds of outcomes. So I think when you put stress on a system, you reveal its weak points, and sometimes you exaggerate its weaknesses and you really bring them out. And there were a number of stressors. I think over the last 4 to 5 years, you had the Trump administration, which was an unusual kind of presidency and was a source of great anxiety for people who didn't see the world the same way and were on the other side, and that includes me. Mm-hmm. It was, the COVID stuff. Obviously, we had some weird economic dislocations since the Great Recession moving forward. And then, of course, the wave of protests and violence and riots and all that sort of thing, which really tests a city's municipal character in a way that has, I think, shown Minneapolis to be lacking.
Help us understand what you came to understand about the caucus system and how it's influenced the ascendancy of the progressives.
Yeah, caucuses are funny, and because they exaggerate the power of relatively small minorities who are very, very well organized, as opposed to a primary system, which you have to. It is essentially a moderating influence because of the way it's structured, whereas a caucus isn't. So a caucus, will be dominated by the most committed, most fanatical, least employed people, because it takes time and effort and all that, whereas an election will tend to be dominated by people who are more moderate because they're just going to the polls and casting a ballot. So I think it brings out a very different kind of system. And this is a problem we've seen in American politics in some ways, where we do things that are supposed to be democratizing, but they actually are radicalizing. So we've spent, 50 years really more systematically weakening the role of American political parties. There was a point in time where neither Bernie Sanders nor Donald Trump would have been anywhere near anyone's presidential nomination.
You're
A party
right.
machine in the famous smoke-filled back room would have just kept that off the table. And you know what? I have some sentimental attachment to the smoke-filled room because when you have this other way of doing things, it may be more democratic in a sense, but it brings out that kind of populist radicalism. It rewards extremism. It rewards a more confrontational kind of politics rather than a politics of consensus and cooperation, which is what I think we really need. There aren't a lot of conservatives who talk that way right now, unfortunately. I'm pretty lonely in that camp, but that's really the only way to manage public affairs in a society as large and diverse and complex as ours.
What could possibly be the end game for progressivism? What is it they hope to achieve? I think they're nuts. They must not think they're nuts.
I was reading something there. I'm blanking on the man's name. He's a Marxist socialist writer, and but he has a really interesting view of this thing.
Who is this? I didn't catch his name, Kevin. Who are you talking about?
I can't remember. I can't remember it. I'm
Oh,
sorry.
okay. All right.
I can't remember off the top of my head. There's a really interesting essay. I'll see if I can find it, and I'll link to it on the corner. But his take on it, which is my take, is essentially this is class war. You have a certain class of people who tend to be college-educated, urban, suburban professionals, people in government work, people who are attached to either big corporations or big government agencies, who make up a kind of professional class. And what they're really trying to do is entrench their power, their position, and their status. So you don't really see much of a uprising among the very poor in the United States, for example. Even things like the anti-police protests were largely led by people with college-educated backgrounds, middle-class, upper-middle-class people. So what you're really seeing is a kind of, to use the classic Marxist terms, a sort of bourgeois class war effort that's posing as a kind of populist revolution, but isn't that at all.
It leaves a terrible vacancy with the emphasis on declining hopefully eliminating the police force from their standpoint. The abandonment of entire intersections, as you pointed out, 38th and Chicago. We had a nice chat with Annette Meeks about that, and she's concerned that we just don't have a very terribly bright future here in terms of returning to some sort of semblance of unity, civility, and competent safety.
Yeah, the thing about public discourse is that it's dominated by a certain group of people, people like us. And the public discourse tends to reflect the interests and desires and anxieties of the people who dominate that conversation, which is why we have a lot of stories in the New York Times about Harvard's admissions policies, but not about New York City's high school dropout rate, because nobody cares about it. So you see this playing out in our politics, particularly on the left right now, where we're having this big discussion about forgiving the loans of people who went to college, including people who went to Harvard Law School and places like that. Well, right now, if you were to pay off the unpaid rent of all of the Americans who are largely poor people who have lost their jobs and fallen behind in their rent because of the lockdowns and the coronavirus, that would cost 1/22nd of what it would cost to pay off student loans of these largely well-off people. But no one's talking about doing that. That is something that people who are actually in need, people who are actually in a really bad situation, who could probably be helped, even though there's some reasons not to want to do that, but who could be helped relatively cheaply compared to things we're talking about, like paying off student loans. But nobody cares about those people because they're poor nobodies who are behind on their rent and they didn't go to Harvard. And the class of people that we really care about are largely college graduates, largely professionals, largely urban and suburban, and they really, really dominate the conversation, and their interests are at the middle of everything. And you see this in Minneapolis as well, too, where those people aren't really hurting. The neighborhoods they live in aren't nearly as affected by crime as the places where poor people live. Their property values are still going up. Right now, some of their cultural amenities and things like that have been interrupted, but they expect to get that stuff back. They don't care as much about the public schools and that sort of stuff because they tend to disproportionately send their own kids to private schools, and they've got the money to have some choice about that. including the choice of where they live, which is another form of school choice that's reserved to wealthy people, even if they have their kids in public schools. So their lives aren't going to be affected all that negatively by the incompetence of the current government in the city of Minneapolis. But the kind of posturing, social justice stuff that goes along with it makes them feel good. It's kind of entertainment, it's a sort of release. It's it's a kind of group therapy session in a sense. And so they're willing to make that trade-off to, well, let's have things that make us feel good, and even if they're accompanied by irresponsible and incompetent government, because that doesn't actually hurt us all that much. Now, they would never characterize their views that way, but I think that's pretty obvious what's going on.
I have long contended that the political class on both sides of the aisle live on what we've been calling the third rail. They lead lives independent from the rest of us. We're not running into them at the hardware store. We're not running into them at the same movie theater. We're not running into them at the same church. It seems as though they live a life on a parallel universe to the average American.
Yeah, and I don't really think that's the problem, though. I think the problem is the opposite of that. That we have this politics that demands a kind of radical identification between people in elected office and the ordinary people. And they're just not. They're not the same kind of people. Ted Cruz can go out there and do his Ted Cruz shtick and pretend like, he's a cowboy from East Texas, but he went to Princeton and Harvard Law School. We all know this. He's not a regular guy. His wife works for Goldman Sachs. And there's no sense pretending otherwise. But the fact that politicians feel the need to engage in this kind of ceremonial, ritual identification with the ordinary people actually, I think, leads them to a lot of bad policy decisions, because you get things that come up from the angry masses who will say things like, let's defund the police department, or let's just spend money on this because it sounds like a good idea and not worry about what happens tomorrow. What you need is real leadership, and leadership often means telling the people no.
Yeah. What do you see as you identify in your piece in the National Review that Minneapolis still has a two-party system? It's just that the two parties are basically factions of the DFL, one more liberal than the other. What do you see for the future of cities like Minneapolis? I know you pointed it out in the National Review, but I want to hear it from you.
Yeah, well, it'll really depend on whether they can achieve a position where they are still on balance desirable places to live. You saw this in New York City under Giuliani and later under Bloomberg, where it still had a lot of problems and it had a lot of bad governance, but it had enough going for it that people wanted to be there, and that brought in young people, that brought in money, that brought in investment, and that kept the city going. But that doesn't happen everywhere, and not every city has what New York and Los Angeles have, or even Chicago or Houston or cities of that size. You've got a lot of cities kind of in the middle, and this is where Minneapolis is, that don't have the virtues of a small town, but also don't necessarily have the virtues of a really, truly large city like Los Angeles or New York. And those are kind of in the middle. And I think that places like Minneapolis and Atlanta and Dallas and Cincinnati are going to get squeezed because they're not one or the other. And so if you end up with a worst of both worlds situation where you've got all the problems of a big city, but none of the attractions of it, and you see that in a lot of places. That's certainly been the case of Cleveland for a while. Then it's really hard to get out of that. It's hard to attract new people. It's hard to attract investment, and these problems tend to make themselves worse over the years. I mean, we saw this in Detroit, which from 1960 through the day before yesterday was just on a ruthlessly downward trajectory.
Mm-hmm. What would your forecast be if the Chauvin trial results in rioting, the likes of which might even be larger than what we saw last May? Could Minneapolis recover from another round of that?
Well, of course it could recover. Lots of things can happen, but I think it's not as likely to. If you look at the cities that were having a lot of trouble in the 1960s and the early 1970s, the ones that really didn't make it back were the ones that had the worst rioting. Detroit, Trenton, places like that.
Newark.
And the ones where, Newark. And the ones that didn't have it as bad managed to come along. But even within cities, you can still see the scars of that. You can see it in Los Angeles. You can see it in New York. where there are vast stretches of the Bronx that are essentially still unpopulated. So Minneapolis is going to become one or the other. It's going to be a city that gets a handle on this sort of thing and figures out how to conduct its business in a relatively effective way, or it's going to enter into a long and possibly steep, but probably not that steep, period of decline. But, even gentle decline can be really hard on a city, and if it lasts for long enough, you end up in the same place.
I understood from your piece that you are not necessarily trusting that Jacob Fry is the answer.
He does not seem like it. Although even him, kind of crackpot that he is, you see this in other mayors too, including Eric Johnson here in Dallas, who's not the guitarist, by the way, different Eric Johnson.
Good.
Who they can be people who are kind of crackpots and talk like crazy people, but once you put them in office, they're like, oh, well, these problems look a lot different now that I'm responsible for them. So even Jacob Fry was trying to. He was a moderating force compared to where most of the city council was, and to where a lot of activist politics in Minneapolis were, and he still is in some ways. But he's certainly not a strong enough leader or competent enough one to be an effective counteraction on that. And this is where you see a real difference with a figure like, say, Bloomberg in New York, who had a very crazy city council himself, and a very crazy city, and a much more difficult city to manage in many ways than Minneapolis is. But he was an effective, competent administrator, an effective, competent leader, and a pretty strong personality who was able to impose himself on that political system and produce a degree of competency and accountability.
Well, let's get back to caucusing. Bloomberg had real life experience. We are experiencing in the political class here in Minneapolis and St. Paul essentially activists who have never done any auditing. They've never done any finance work. They've never done any budgeting. They've never met a payroll. This is what they do for a living, and it shows in the way they're manifesting themselves.
Yeah, I saw this a lot. I was a newspaper editor for years and years and years, and I would have people who would come in and apply for jobs, and they were, fresh out of college, and they were idealistic, and they wanted to change the world. And I would ask them the first question in the interview would be, explain to me what millage is. Mm-hmm. And they would look at me like I had asked them, to solve some difficult particle physics problem. And I would tell them, your parents know what this is because they pay taxes. They figure this stuff out. You don't know what it is, and you need to know, because that's what our newspaper is really going to be about in many ways, is how we gather taxes and what we do with them. Our politics is very dominated by lawyers, because being a lawyer is kind of a job that leads to being in politics. It has the same kind of verbal skills, and also it's an relatively easy way to put yourself in a financial position where you can afford to take some time off and run for a political office. I think it's been bad for our politics to be so dominated by lawyers. Lately, we've seen the same kind of phenomenon with people who have academic backgrounds, you kind of Elizabeth Warren types, who also, make a fair bit of money, but have pretty flexible schedules, and that makes it easier for them to get into politics. I like lawyers, especially when I need one, which is often enough. And I like college professors, and I used to teach college myself. But you don't necessarily want a system that is dominated by people like that. You also don't want this dominated by business managers. Republicans are often saying, "We run the country like a business." That's not how government works. It's not a business. And we've had some businessmen president who weren't very good. I won't attach any names to that, but I can think of a couple. And you need a wide variety of sets of skills, and you also need a kind of a path of progress through politics. One of the problems with Donald Trump being president was it was his first job in politics, and it's not an entry-level job. And people who spend some time on, I volunteered on the library board, and then I served on this commission, and then I ran for city council, and I was there for 20 years, and then I ran for mayor, have a very different view and a very different approach to things, I think, than people who say, well, I just want a big payout in this litigation I was involved in, and now I've got $5 million in my pocket, and I can afford to take a year or two off and go be mayor. And I think that's you get a very different kind of politician and a very different kind of leadership when that's your norm. And I think that's unfortunately where we are. I think there is we get the worst of professionalizing politics rather than the best of it. There are things people complain about career politicians and professional politicians. That's not necessarily a bad thing to be. I mean, people with some experience and knowledge and know-how and relationships can actually create a lot of real value. There are problems that go along with that. And our way of doing things right now is we get the worst aspects of political careerism rather than the best ones.
Are you confident the country's divide will heal, or doesn't it need to?
I always describe myself as a long-term optimist, short-term pessimist. My short-term pessimism is a lot stronger right now than my long-term optimism is. I think the United States is a soul-sick country. We've got real problems that are rooted in our culture and in our families and in the way we conduct our lives and the condition of our spiritual lives. And these are not things that can be fixed by tweaking a tax or passing a regulation or putting some better people on a court or putting some better people on a commission or electing a new mayor of Minneapolis. What we're seeing in our politics is manifestation of a bigger, deeper, and much more serious problem that is not necessarily political in nature.
I agree, and I look around and I see the decline of moral and ethical integrity across all races, across all socioeconomic strata. I just see it. I see it as a very large infection in the country.
Yeah, this really started to jump out to me in the 1990s, and I remember the Clinton administration. Of course, I didn't see the world Bill Clinton did, the way Bill Clinton did. He didn't have my kind of politics. But what really shocked me about Clinton was his admirers and the way they enjoyed being lied to. The whole slick thing, the slick Willie thing, it ended up becoming a kind of badge of honor. Watch him go. He's so good at this. He's so good at misleading people. He's so good at being a weasel. And there's this thing in America now we have where people like to be lied to as long as they're being told the lies they want to hear and as long as they're being lied to skillfully. So it used to be that we didn't want to be pandered to. We didn't want to be flattered. And now we insist that we be pandered to. And we insist that we be flattered. And there's nothing good is going to come of that.
No, you're right.
That's a brilliant take. Yeah.
Kenny, I think we found the new host for Garage Logic if Joe decides to
Joe,
retire.
if you need to retire, we'll see you later. Kevin, you don't even have to move here to do the gig. You can stay right in Dallas. Yeah.
Well,
I want to follow you. Do you have a regular column in the National Review?
Yeah, I'm a regular staffer at National Review. I've been for about 12, 13 years now. So I usually write.
Well, I apologize for
five
my.
times a week.
I apologize.
That's okay.
Yeah.
I'm in National Review, and I write about twice a month in the New York Post, and I write books and stuff.
Well, join the club. I hope you make money on yours.
They're doing all right. It could always be better, so go buy them, folks.
Kevin, I really appreciate your time, and I hope we get to chat again.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed the conversation.
All right, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Kevin D. Williamson with the National Review.
Wow.
He's now on my list to read. And maybe I'll just go and get me a subscription to the National Review. How's that?